In September of 1931, a fishing boat called the Colinda was working the North Sea, about 25 miles off the coast of England, far out over deep, open water with the land long out of sight behind them. The crew hauled up their net, expecting fish. What they got instead was a lump of old peat, the kind of dark, compressed bog you'd find in a wet field, not at the bottom of the sea. One of the men broke it open, and inside there was a tool, a spear point carved from a deer's antler, with a row of small barbs cut neatly down one edge. Someone had made it by hand. Someone had sat down, picked up an antler and shaped it with skill and patience to use to spear fish. And then, somehow, that tool had ended up 25 miles out to sea, buried in peat, on the floor of the North Sea, where there has been nothing but cold grey water for thousands of years. Peat doesn't form at the bottom of the ocean. Peat forms on land, in bogs and marshes, in wet ground full of reeds and moss and slow rivers. So that spot, 25 miles out to sea, was once dry land. Land with marshes. Land where a person once stood and made a tool and lived. That land has a name now. We call it Doggerland. And tonight, we're going to go there. So where exactly was it? Who were the people living there, fishing those marshes and carving those antler points? Was it the cold, bleak, frozen place you might picture when you hear the word prehistoric? Or was it something much greener and much more alive? How could anyone possibly know if the whole country is now at the bottom of the sea? And the big one, what happened to it? How does an entire inhabited land simply vanish? We'll get to all of it soon. We have all the time in the world tonight and know where we need to be. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, and we will be here to do this for you again every single night. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what the weather's like outside your window. Something to think about as we go somewhere the weather stopped mattering a very long time ago. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, let your feet settle and get warm. And let's go back to a green country that isn't on any map. Let's start with the map, because the map is where most of us go wrong. If you picture Britain, you picture an island. England, Scotland, and Wales sitting in the sea, with a sensible amount of water between them and the rest of Europe. That picture feels permanent, like the natural, default shape of the world, the way it's always been. It is, in fact, extremely recent. For most of the time humans have lived in this part of the world, Britain was not an island at all. It was a peninsula, a corner of the European mainland. You could have walked from what is now Yorkshire to what is now the Netherlands without once getting your feet wet, assuming you took a reasonably direct route and didn't stop to admire every river on the way. The land that filled that gap, the whole stretch between Britain and Denmark and the Netherlands, is what we're calling Doggerland. And the first thing to clear up is what it was not. It was not a land bridge. That phrase gets used a lot, and it does the place a real disservice. A bridge is a thing you cross. A bridge is for getting from one important place to another important place, ideally without lingering. And for a long time, That's how people pictured Doggerland, a cold, muddy corridor that early humans hurried across on their way to somewhere better. It was not a corridor. Nobody was hurrying. Doggerland was the somewhere better. It was bigger than a good many countries on the map today. A whole landmass with its own rivers, its own hills, its own coastline, its own weather. People didn't pass through it. They lived in it for thousands of years, the way you live in a country, as home. And the when matters, so let's get our bearings. We're in the period archaeologists call the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, in the early part of our current warm spell, after the last ice age had loosened its grip and the great ice sheets had pulled back to the north. Roughly speaking, the world we're visiting's the one that existed between about 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. The deep cold was over. The land was warming and greening and filling up with life. Which brings us to the second thing most people get wrong, and it's the bigger one. When you hear Stone Age, your mind probably reaches for a particular picture. Snow, bare rock, a bleak brown landscape with a mammoth standing on it, looking cold. Someone in a shapeless fur, gnawing on something, having a thoroughly miserable time of it. Put that picture down. That is not where we're going tonight. The mammoth can stay home. Because the Doggerland we're visiting was green. So that's where we're headed next. Into the morning, in a living country that just happens to be underwater now. So let's go to the morning. Imagine you wake up, not in a cave. We can put that idea down as well, but in a shelter near the edge of a slow, wide river. It's summer. The light is coming up grey and soft over a landscape that runs flat and green in every direction, further than you can see. This is what's around you. Reed beds, tall and whispering, lining the banks. Beyond them, woodland, real woodland, oak and elm and hazel. The kind of mixed forest that drops acorns and nuts you can gather by the basketful in autumn. And between the trees and the water, marshes, shallow, reedy, dotted with standing pools, the sort of ground that looks like nothing much until you understand what's in it. Because to modernize, a marsh looks like wasted land, too wet to build on, too soft to farm, the kind of place an estate agent would call challenging. To the people who lived here, a marsh was a supermarket that restocked itself. Fish in the channels, eels in the mud, ducks and geese and swans overhead in numbers. We can barely picture now. So many birds that the sound of them lifting off the water at dawn would have been less like birdsong and more like weather. Reeds for building and weaving. Shellfish, frogs, the eggs of 100 kinds of bird. If you knew what you were doing, and these people absolutely knew what they were doing, you did not go hungry here. Not in summer. Out past the marsh, in the open woodland, there's bigger game. Red deer moving in herds, wild boar rooting through the undergrowth, aurochs, the huge wild cattle that once roamed Europe, taller at the shoulder than a man and best given a generous amount of room. Beavers damming the smaller streams, pike in the rivers as long as your arm. And there are people. Not many. This is a world with a great deal of room in it. But here, around you, is your band. A few families, the people you've known your whole life. Smoke is already rising from a small fire, thin and blue, straight up into the still air. Someone is awake before you, as someone always is, coaxing the fire back to life from the embers they banked the night before. A dog lifts its head, watches you for a moment, decides you are not especially interesting, and goes back to sleep. We should be careful with that dog, by the way. Careful in the way this whole story is going to ask us to be. We know people right across Mesolithic Europe kept dogs. The evidence for that is solid. What we don't have is a dog's collar with Doggerland stamped on it. So picture the dog, because a dog almost certainly belongs in this picture. But know that we're filling in a likely detail, not reading you a receipt. The air smells of wood smoke and river and wet green growing things. It's going to be a warm day. There is food to gather and tools to mend, and nowhere in particular you have to be by any particular time, because the calendar has not been invented and won't be for a very long while yet. This is the world that Antler Spear Point came from. Not a frozen waste, not a corridor. A green, wide, generous country on a summer morning with the birds coming up off the water like weather. Now, who exactly are the people waking up around that fire? They were not primitive. I want to take that word out and leave it by the door, because it does nothing but mislead. When we say Stone Age, it's easy to hear simple. Stupid, even. People who hadn't figured things out yet, fumbling through a hard life with crude tools, waiting for real history to start. That picture isn't just unkind. It's wrong, in a way that's genuinely interesting once you see it. Take the tools. That antler point from the Colinda, the one with the neat row of barbs down its edge, is not a crude object. It is a precise one. Whoever made it understood their material completely, how antler behaves, where it's strong, how to work it without splitting it, exactly how to angle each barb so a speared fish couldn't wriggle back off. That's the work of someone who has made many of these, taught by someone who made many more, in a line of skill running back hundreds of generations. And it's not one tool, it's a whole kit. Tiny, razor-sharp blades of flint, which we call microliths, set into wooden shafts and bone handles to make arrows and knives and harpoons. Fish hooks, almost certainly nets woven from plant fiber, and traps and weirs set into the river channels to catch fish while the people went off and did something else, which is, when you think about it, just early outsourcing. They worked hide into fitted, sewn clothing, stitched with bone needles, because a person who lives outdoors through a northern winter does not wear a shapeless sack and hope for the best. And they made boats. Here's how we can be fairly sure of that. Off the south coast of England, underwater, there's a Mesolithic site we'll come back to shortly, where archaeologists found worked timber so sophisticated it changed what we thought these people could do. Split planks, real joinery, the kind of carpentry nobody expected from this period at all. People who can do that can certainly hollow a log into a canoe. And in a country laced with rivers and marshes and open water, a boat isn't a luxury. It's how you get to the shops. And they weren't alone, and they weren't desperate. This is one of the corrections the evidence keeps making. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as a constant, gnawing emergency. every single day a grim scramble not to die. But a skilled people in a rich place who know every plant and animal and season around them are not in a constant emergency. They have time. Time to make a spear point beautiful as well as useful. Time to teach the children properly. Time to sit by the fire in the evening and tell the stories that we will never, ever get to hear. And hold on to that, because that particular silence turns out to be one of the most interesting things about this whole drowned world. For now, just adjust the picture. Not grunting cave people. Skilled fishers and hunters and woodworkers and parents who knew their green country the way you know your own street and lived in it well. Which raises the obvious question, the one you might be turning over right now, half asleep, and quite reasonably. If this whole place is at the bottom of the North Sea and has been for thousands of years, how could anyone possibly know any of this? The trees, the tools, the marshes, the boats. How do we know? That is a genuinely good question, and the answer is one of the best parts of the story. So, how do you study a country that's underwater? The answer is that the North Sea has been handing it back to us, piece by piece, for almost 100 years, and only fairly recently have we started to properly listen. It began with fishermen, like the crew of the Colinda. For generations, trawlers dragging the sea bottom kept pulling up things that didn't belong there. Lumps of peat, bones of land animals, deer, the occasional mammoth tusk, worked tools like our antler point. The fishermen even had a name for the peat, moorlog. They cursed it because it clogged the nets and threw most of it back. For a long time, nobody put it together. Nobody stood on a fishing deck holding a lump of bog hauled from the open sea and thought, hang on, this is a clue. When people finally did start thinking about it, the picture came together slowly, and then lately very fast. There are a few ways we now read the drowned world. The first is to map it. Oil and gas companies, surveying the sea floor with sound, sending pulses down and listening to the echoes, produced astonishingly detailed maps of what lies beneath the seabed. And researchers realized those maps were showing them landscape. Buried under the mud are the ghosts of Doggerland's rivers, old valleys, winding channels, the bed of a great river system, all of it sitting there, preserved, like a photograph of a country taken from above and then sunk. The second way is to dig underwater. Off the Isle of Wight, on the south coast of England, there's a submerged site called Bouldnor Cliff. It sits about 11 meters down, and it is, frankly, an archaeological miracle. A Mesolithic settlement that the rising sea sealed and protected instead of smashing. Divers have brought up worked flints by the hundred, nearly 1,000 from one spot alone, along with hearths and that astonishing worked timber I mentioned. Bouldnor Cliff is a direct window into exactly the life we've been imagining. Real tools, real fire, real carpentry from around 8,000 years ago. And then there's the newest piece, and it's a remarkable one. In 2026, a team of scientists published a study that did something that would have sounded like pure magic not long ago. They took cores of sediment from deep under the North Sea, long tubes of mud pulled up from the drowned land, And they recovered ancient DNA straight out of the dirt, not from bones, from the mud itself, which holds the genetic traces of the plants and animals that lived and died there, locked into the layers like pages in a book. And what they read out of the mud was green. The DNA showed temperate trees: oak, elm, hazel, and lime, which is a tree that likes warmth, growing in southern Doggerland earlier than anyone had recorded for this part of the world. So the mud confirms it from the ground up. Not cold tundra, not a barren land bridge, but a mild, wooded, living country. Exactly the green world we've been walking through all night. Now, here's the point where I have to head something off, because whenever Doggerland gets into the news, somebody reaches for the same word: Atlantis. Britain's Atlantis. The Atlantis of the North Sea. It makes a great headline. It is not what this is. Atlantis is a story Plato made up to make a philosophical point, a fictional advanced empire with palaces and fleets that the gods drowned for getting above itself. Doggerland had none of that. No kings, no temples, no marble city sliding under the waves. Reaching for Atlantis actually makes the real thing smaller by measuring it against a fantasy. What we have is better, precisely because it's real. Not a lost super civilization, but a lost home. A green, ordinary, lived-in country full of capable people that the sea took. Which is the question we've been circling all night, and we can't put it off any longer. If it was this rich, and this alive, and this real, where did it go? Before we follow the water down, let's stay in the green country a little longer, long enough to watch one whole year turn. Because a life here wasn't a single, endless summer morning. It moved with the seasons, and each season asked something different. Start in spring, as the ice loosened its grip on the marsh edges. The rivers filled with fish coming up from the sea to spawn, in runs thick enough to take in numbers that would last. The birds came back to the marshes to nest, and with them came eggs, protein, free for the gathering, if you knew which reed beds to wade into. After the lean end of winter, spring was the world refilling its shelves. Summer sent the band ranging wider, following the deer to their grazing, working the coast, gathering the early plants. Long days, warm nights, the easy stretch of the year, when the country gave freely and a skilled band could build up the strength and the stores they would need later. Come the autumn, the work that the whole year pointed towards arrived. This was when the woodland paid out. Hazelnuts by the sackful, acorns, fruits and roots that could be dried and kept. The deer were fat and in their prime. Everything that could be preserved was preserved, smoked, dried, stored against the cold, because everyone in that band knew exactly what was coming and exactly how much it would matter. And then the cold came, and it came hard. Let's not pretty that up. The marsh that fed you all summer freezes at its edges and gives less. The birds leave. The days shrink down to a few hours of thin grey light, and the cold is the serious, patient kind that kills the unprepared. This is the season the comfortable version of prehistory likes to skip over. They didn't get to skip it. They lived it every year. But here's the interesting part. And it's why we walked through the whole year with them. They were ready for it. Winter was hard, but it was not a surprise, and it was not faced alone. The stores were in. The fitted clothing was made and mended. The fire was kept burning. The shelter was banked against the wind. And around that fire was the band, the same handful of families, the old people who had seen 60 winters and knew the tricks of it, the children, everyone close together in the dark. They got through it the way people have always gotten through hard things, by having prepared for it and by not being on their own. And those long winter nights are almost certainly when the stories happened. The talk, the teaching. We know these people had language, full, complex, capable language, every bit as rich as yours. They had to. You cannot hand down this much skill, this much knowledge of season and animal and place without it. So picture the winter fire and the talk going round it, the arguments, the jokes, the old stories told again. And then sit for a moment with the strange fact that we will never hear a single word of it. Not their language, not their names for the rivers, not one story. That sound is simply gone. It's one of the things the sea didn't hand back. A whole year, then, turning over in a green country, spring fish, summer range, autumn store, winter fire. Generation after generation, this was the shape of a good life. And it worked. It worked for thousands of years. Which is what makes the next part so strange to get your head around. Because a world this settled, this well-run, this deeply known, you'd think a place like that would last. It didn't. And the way it ended is not the way you would expect. When we imagine a land going under the sea, we imagine a flood, a wall of water, a single terrible day, people running for high ground. It's dramatic, and it's how the story usually gets told. That is mostly not what happened to Doggerland. What happened to Doggerland was much slower, and in its own way much stranger. So slow that nobody living through it would have called it a disaster at all. Here's the engine of it. When the last ice age ended, all that ice, the enormous sheets that had covered the north, melted, and all that water went into the sea. For thousands of years, the world's oceans rose, steadily, centimetre by centimetre, year after year. Doggerland was low, flat country. And low, flat country is exactly what a rising sea takes first. It doesn't need a wave. It just needs time, and it had all the time there was. So picture it not as a flood, but as a tide that simply never goes back out as far as it used to. And picture it across lifetimes, because that's the only way it makes any sense. A man grows up fishing a particular marsh. By his old age, that marsh is a little wetter, a little saltier than he remembers. The good spots shifted. He mentions it, maybe, the way old people everywhere mention that things have changed. His grandchildren grow up fishing the new spots, which are simply where the water is now. They never knew the old ones, so they don't miss them. A camp the family used for generations grows too marshy to use, and then it's a mudflat, and then a lifetime on. It's shallows you could pole a boat across. Nobody decided to abandon it. The water just slowly became the answer to where it used to be. That's the thing that's genuinely hard to hold in your head. Nobody in Doggerland ever stood on a shore and watched their country die. There was no last day, no single moment of loss they could point to. Each generation simply had a little less land than the one before, and a little more sea, and for every one of them, that was just how the world was. The catastrophe is only visible from up here, thousands of years later, looking down at the whole timeline at once. Lived from the inside, it wasn't a catastrophe at all. It was the coast, moving, the way coasts do, except that it never stopped. And the people did what people do. They followed the good ground inland. They moved with the fishing. Over those long centuries, some drifted onto the higher land that is now Britain, others onto what is now the European mainland. They didn't flee. They adjusted slowly, the way you'd adjust to anything that takes 10 generations to arrive. The skills went with them. The knowledge went with them. The green country didn't end in a scream. It ended in a long, slow retreat that none of the people making it would have recognized as an ending. So if it was all that gradual, you might reasonably ask whether anything sudden ever happened at all, whether there was ever a single hard blow in all those centuries of patient water. There was, once, and we should talk about it honestly, because it's real, and it's dramatic, and it has been blamed for rather more than it probably deserves. About 8,000 years ago, around 6,200 BC, off the coast of Norway, a colossal piece of the seabed gave way. It's called the Storegga Slide, a vast section of the continental shelf, soft sediment built up over ages, broke loose and slid down into the deep Atlantic. It was one of the largest underwater landslides we know of anywhere on Earth. And when that much material moves that suddenly underwater, it shoves the sea ahead of it. It sends a tsunami. We know this one happened, and we're not guessing. It left its signature all around the northern seas, a distinct layer of sand thrown far inland and then buried, that geologists have since found in Scotland, in Norway, in Denmark, in the Faroe Islands, even traced across the floor of the North Sea itself. A wave reached up onto what is now the east coast of Scotland and dumped sand kilometers from the shore. By any measure, it was enormous. And it would have struck what was left of Doggerland. By this point, Doggerland was already much reduced. Much of it was already sea, and what remained was low islands and coast, exactly the kind of ground a great wave does the most damage to. For anyone living on those shores that day, it would have been sudden and violent, and for many of them, almost certainly fatal. We shouldn't look away from that. It was a real catastrophe for real people. But here's where the story tends to overreach. You'll sometimes hear that the Storegga Wave is what sank Doggerland. That this one day is the ending. The great flood that drowned the last green country in a single afternoon. It's a tidy story. It's only a theory and a shaky one. The land had been going under for centuries before the wave, and kept going under for centuries after. The wave was a terrible blow to a place that was already mostly gone. Not the cause of the drowning, but one hard moment inside a much longer, quieter process. It may well have flooded the last low-lying parts for good. It may have been the final push, but it did not sink a thriving country in a day, because there was no thriving country left to sink. The slow water had already done most of the work. So the most dramatic single event in the whole story of Doggerland turns out to be a kind of footnote to the real ending, which was just water rising patiently for longer than the whole of recorded history put together. The wave is what you'd put in the film. The slow tide is what actually did it. And after the wave, and after the last of the high ground slipped under, the green country was gone. So the question we end on is this: what happens to a whole world and a whole people after they vanish from the map? What is actually left of them? Here's the honest shape of what we've lost, and it's worth sitting with, because the gaps are as much a part of this story as the facts. We have the land itself, in outline, the rivers, the valleys, mapped under the seabed. We have the tools, the antler point, the flints, the worked wood from Bouldnor Cliff. We have the trees, read out of the mud as DNA. We have the shape of how they lived, pieced together from all of it, and from what we know of people like them across Europe. That's a great deal. A century ago, we had almost none of it. The drowned country has been more generous than anyone had any right to expect. But there is a hard edge to what the sea kept, and what it didn't. We don't know their names. We don't know what they called themselves, or their land, or the great river that ran through it. We don't know the names of their gods, if they had any, or of their dead, or of their children. We have no faces. And this is the one that stays with me. We do not have one single word of anything they ever said. Remember those winter fires and the talk going round them? The stories, the jokes, the knowledge handed down. All of it ran on language, real, full, complex language, as rich as anything spoken on earth today. It existed. It mattered enormously to them. It was how they held their entire world together. And it is completely, permanently gone. Not lost and waiting to be found, like a sunken tool. Gone in a way that nothing will ever bring back, because sound leaves no layer in the mud. We can pull a deer's DNA out of the seabed. We will never recover a single sentence. And the honest thing to do, the thing this channel will always try to do, is to leave that gap empty, instead of filling it with something invented. It would be easy to make up a name for our fisher by the river, give him a family and a last day and a tragic little story, and it might even be moving. But it wouldn't be true, and it would paper over the most interesting thing here, that there were thousands upon thousands of real human lives, every bit as full and complicated as yours, that we can know almost everything about, except the things they themselves would most want us to know. Their world, we can partly rebuild. Them, as people, we have to let stay unknown. So it would be easy to leave it there. A green world, drowned, its people gone and silent, a sad, finished thing at the bottom of the sea. But that isn't quite the whole of it, because gone turns out to be the wrong word for what happened to Doggerland. And that is where we'll end. Because the people of Doggerland did not vanish. That's the part the word lost gets wrong. The sea took their land. It did not take them. Across those long centuries of rising water, they moved onto the higher ground that became Britain, onto the coasts that became the Netherlands and Denmark and the wider European shore. They carried their skills, their knowledge, their tools, and their children with them. The people who would go on to live in those places for the next several thousand years were, in part, them. The same families simply standing on whatever was still dry. Doggerland didn't end. It relocated. And the land itself didn't really end either. It changed jobs. The drowned hills of Doggerland are still down there, shaping the sea above them. One of them, a great submerged bank out in the middle of the North Sea, is so shallow and so rich that it has been one of Europe's finest fishing grounds for centuries. The fishermen who work it have a name for it. They call it the Dogger Bank, which is exactly where the name Doggerland came from in the first place. The old country is still feeding people. It just does it underwater now, and most of the people it feeds have no idea they're fishing the hills of a drowned world. And every so often, it sends something up. A net snags on a lump of moorlog and brings a piece of the old land into the daylight. A core comes up full of ancient pollen. An antler point, carved by a careful hand on a summer riverbank 10,000 years ago, turns up in a fishing net in 1931 and ends up in a museum where you can go and stand and look at it, a real object made by a real person in a country that is now sea. That is not a dead world. A dead world stays buried and stays quiet. This one is still handing things up to us, still being read, still this very decade, telling us things we didn't know, right down to the color of its forests. It is the most active, generous, talkative, drowned country imaginable. It just works slowly. So that's Doggerland, not Atlantis, not a myth, not a bleak bridge that people hurried across. A green, living country full of skilled and ordinary people that the slow sea took back so gradually that no one inside it ever saw it end. And that is still, even now, surfacing piece by piece into our hands. So here we are, back in the present, where the North Sea is just the North Sea, grey and cold and busy with ships and trawlers and wind farms, giving no sign at all of what lies underneath it. But it's under there. Tonight, while you're lying here, the drowned country is exactly where it has been for 8,000 years. The buried rivers, the old hills, the peat, the tools, the silent layers of mud full of the DNA of vanished forests. Somewhere out in the dark, a trawler is dragging its net across the hills of Doggerland. And maybe, tonight, or next week, or next year, it'll snag a lump of moorlog and bring another piece of the green world up into the light. That's a good thing to drift off on, I think. Not a sad thing, just a strange and genuinely wonderful one, that an entire country, with its rivers and its forests and its careful, clever people, is still down there beneath the everyday sea, still giving itself back to anyone patient enough to look. So let the day go now. Let the lights stay low. Pull the blanket up over your shoulder and let your feet settle, warm and still. We've come a long way tonight, across a green country that no map remembers, on a summer morning 10,000 years gone. There's nothing left to do, and nowhere left to be. Let the marsh birds lift off the water one more time, somewhere out in the dark behind your eyes, and sleep well. We'll be here to do this for you again tomorrow night. So, 600 years ago, and a little more. In the high, far southwest of China, in a province of misted mountains called Yunnan, a boy was born into a Muslim family. They were people with long memories and far horizons folded into those memories. For his father and his father's father before him had made the great pilgrimage west, all the way to Mecca, across deserts and mountains and seas that the boy, in his green and quiet valley, could only try to picture. They had gone to the very ends of the world they knew, and come home again, carrying the memory of all that distance. So even there, in those landlocked hills, with no ocean for 1,000 miles in any direction, the idea of distance was in him from the very start. The sense that the world was enormous, that it stretched on and on far beyond the last blue ridge of the mountains, and that a person, an ordinary person, might set out across it and see its far edges and return. The boy's name, in those early years, was Ma He, a child of the mountains in a quiet province at the soft green edge of a vast empire. He could not have known what was coming. None of us ever can. His childhood did not stay gentle for very long. In those years, the new rulers of China, a dynasty called the Ming, were finishing the long and difficult work of taking the whole country under their hand. And Yunnan, his home, far away in the southwest, was the very last region to hold out against them. And so, in time, the war came even there, up into the misted hills, and in the way of those hard old times when the armies had marched through and the fighting was done, the boy, perhaps 10 years old, was taken from his home. I will tell you this part softly because it is sad, and because you do not need to carry it with you into sleep. As so often happened to captured boys in that age, a thing we would find very hard now, he was taken into the service of the imperial household, made, as such boys were, a servant who would spend his life inside palace walls. And he was carried far away to the north, away from the mountains, away from his family, away from everything green and familiar that he had ever known, and given into the household of a young prince. It could so easily have been the end of him. A small, quiet life, lost somewhere in the endless corridors of a palace. A name no one would ever have written down. That is what became of most such boys. They vanished into the great machinery of the empire, and history never noticed them at all. But it was not the end of him. Far from it. Because the boy was clever, and he was steady, and he was brave. He grew tall and strong, and by every account that survives, he carried himself with a kind of calm that drew people to him. And the young prince he had been given to serve came, slowly, over the years, to trust him completely. They were not so far apart in age. They grew toward manhood alongside one another. The prince and the watchful, capable servant from the southern mountains. And when, after long years of patience, a sudden and bitter war broke out within the ruling family itself, a nephew against an uncle, for the throne of all of China, the servant from Yunnan rode at the prince's side through all of it, and he proved himself again and again in the worst of it. and the prince won, and made himself the emperor of all China. History would come to call him the Yongle Emperor, and when he climbed at last onto that highest of all thrones, he did not forget the quiet, steady man who had stood beside him through everything. He gave him a new name as a mark of the highest honor. He took away the family name of Ma, the name of the mountain boy, and he gave him instead the name Zheng. And so the captured child from the green valleys of the southwest became the man that all of history would remember, Zheng He. You do not need to hold any of these names. Let them be soft sounds drifting through the quiet dark. The boy who was taken, the prince who became an emperor, the old name set down and the new name given, like a door swinging slowly open onto everything that was about to happen. Because the new emperor had an idea so large that it would take thousands of people years simply to build. And he had found, in this calm and capable man who had served him so long, exactly the person to carry it out into the world. The idea was the sea. China in those days already knew the southern oceans well enough. For many centuries, merchant ships had carried silk and porcelain south and west across the water and brought back spices and gems and the goods of distant lands. The sea roads were old and well-traveled. But what this emperor imagined was something on an entirely different scale. Not a handful of trading ships, slipping quietly out to do their business and slipping quietly home. He imagined a fleet, an armada, a floating city of ships, a fleet so vast and so splendid, so far beyond anything that had ever been seen upon the water, that wherever it should appear upon the horizon, every port in all the world would understand in a single breathless glance the wealth and the reach and the sheer overwhelming grandeur of Ming China. And the building of this fleet, and the command of it, and the long voyages it would make to the very ends of the earth, he gave to Zheng He, the man who, as a boy in his mountains, had never once in his life so much as seen the ocean. Let yourself rest there a moment before we go down to the water. Settle a little deeper into the warmth. There is no hurry at all. The story will wait for you. It has waited 600 years already. It can wait while you find the most comfortable stillness, and let your breathing slow, and let the day you have had drift away behind you like a far and fading shore. Good. Now, let us go down to the water, slowly, and watch the great thing being made. Picture a broad river city in the warm Chinese south. Its docks crowded for miles along a wide brown river, the kind of river so large it moves like something alive, sliding steadily down toward the distant sea. And there, along its banks, in great timber shipyards, the most ambitious building project of the entire age was taking shape, slowly, over years. The ships they built there had a name. They were called the treasure ships, and by the old records, the very largest of them were giants. So large, in truth, that scholars still argue about it now, 6 centuries later, over whether the numbers written down can possibly be literally true. Vessels said to be longer than anything that had ever sailed before, with great ribbed sails like the wings of vast birds, and rows of towering masts, and clever sealed compartments down beneath the waterline, so that even if one part of the hull were breached, the water could not spread, and the whole ship would not go down. Whether they were quite so enormous as the oldest chronicles claim, we will never truly know. But on this, everyone agrees. They were vast, floating wooden castles, painted in deep reds and golds, carved and lacquered, riding higher out of the water than the houses on the shore behind them. And there were not only the treasure ships. Around those great vessels, the shipyards built every other kind of ship that a voyage of years might possibly need. There were ships whose holds were great tanks for carrying fresh water, enough to keep thousands of people alive far out on the salt sea. There were ships built to carry horses, ships heavy with grain and rice and all the food a floating town would eat in a year. There were ships for soldiers and ships for trade goods and ships whose only task in all the world was to carry supplies for all the other ships. A whole fleet of every shape and size, hundreds upon hundreds of vessels, slowly gathering at the river's wide mouth. Imagine the work of it, the smell of cut timber and pine pitch and smoke, the endless sound of hammers and adzes and saws rolling along the riverbank from dawn until dark. Whole forests of seasoned wood floated down the rivers and stacked in great yards. The huge curved ribs of a hull rising up like the bones of some enormous animal. And then the planking going on, plank by patient plank. Rope walks where men twisted mile after mile of cordage. Sail lofts where the great sails were stitched. Thousands and thousands of carpenters and smiths and rope makers and sail makers, all of them bent to the one vast task, year after year, of building a fleet to astonish the world. And by the old records, that first great fleet, when at last it was ready, carried more than 300 ships, and aboard them some 27,000 men, an entire town. A small city, really, lifted up off the land and set down upon the water and pointed out toward the open horizon. Let yourself rest there a while, on the riverbank, in the warm air, watching it all take shape. The masts going up, one after another, against a pale and hazy sky. The hammering far off and soft and steady, like a heartbeat. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing to do but watch the ships being born. And then, at last, after all those years, the waiting was over. The fleet was finished, the holds were full, the great sails were bent onto their masts, and the season turned as the sailors had known it would, and the wind that blows across those warm seas each year, the wind they had been waiting for, the way you might wait for a tide, began at last to blow steadily toward the south. They called it the monsoon, and it was the breath that would carry the whole enormous fleet out into the world. Imagine the morning that they left. The wide river crowded with ships from one green bank to the other. The enormous sails unfurling slowly, one after another, red and gold, and the soft brown of canvas filling and stiffening as the wind took hold of them. Drums sounding out across the water, deep and slow, the signal to make way, and then the treasure ships themselves swinging out, one by one, into the river's steady current, riding low and heavy and impossibly magnificent, and streaming out behind them all the hundreds of smaller ships, like a great flock of birds following the slow giants that led them, and the whole vast fleet turning together toward the south, toward the open sea, toward the warm and waiting horizon and all the unknown ports that lay somewhere far beyond it. 27,000 souls going out together onto the wide water, and standing at the head of all of them, the calm man from the mountains, the boy who had been taken from his home and made a servant, and who now commanded the greatest fleet the world had ever known. Let the fleet carry you out, now, gently, away from the land. There is nothing for you to do but drift along with it, out past the river's mouth, out where the brown water turns at last to blue and the shore falls away behind, and there is only the sea and the sky and the warm, steady wind. The voyages would last for months, and then for years. There would be 7 of them in all, spread across nearly 30 years of sailing. And out there, on the open ocean, far from the sight of any shore, life aboard the great ships settled into its own slow and patient rhythm. They found their way across all that trackless water by the oldest and the newest of arts, woven together. By the compass, first of all, the little floating needle that, however the ship might turn, always swung itself back to point steadily toward the south. It was a Chinese invention, the compass, older than these voyages by many centuries, and it was the quiet, faithful heart of their navigation, and by the stars as well. For the navigators of the fleet knew the night sky the way that you know the rooms of your own home in the dark. They had instruments to measure the height of certain chosen stars above the black line of the horizon, and from those careful measurements, taken night after night, they could tell how far north or south the fleet had wandered upon the face of the deep. And so, under the same great wheel of turning stars that you might see tonight, were you to rise and look, the huge ships felt their slow way across the immensity of the ocean. And the ocean was not always gentle with them. There were storms, of course. There must have been many. Nights when the sea rose up black and enormous, and the rain came slashing sideways, and the wind screamed in the rigging, and the lanterns swung wild, and even those vast ships were tossed like leaves upon the heaving dark. In such hours, the sailors prayed. They had a goddess they turned to, a gentle and watchful protector of all those who go out upon the sea, and they trusted her to bring them through the dark. And when they came safely home again, at the end of all their voyaging, they raised great carved stones in her honor, covered in their careful thanks for having carried them through the storms and home alive. But mostly, in the long memory of it, there were not the storms. Mostly there were the calm days, day after gentle day of them, the endless rolling blue, stretching away unbroken to the edge of the world on every side, the warm wind, steady and constant in the sails, the soft and ceaseless sound of the water sliding past the hull, hour upon hour upon hour, and the thousands of men aboard going quietly about the patient work of keeping a floating town alive and moving, far, far out upon the breathing sea. Picture one of those long, calm days, if you like, and let it slow you down. The huge sail above, gently bellied with the wind. The deck rising and falling, slowly, slowly, on the long ocean swell, like something breathing in its sleep. the wide blue all around, the warm sun. Nothing to do but go on and on toward the south, with all the time in the world. You may be settling now. Good. That is exactly right. Let the calm days carry you the way they carried the fleet. And then, after weeks of nothing but water, there would come a morning when the lookouts high up on the masts began to cry out. Land. Land ahead. A green coast rising slowly from the sea. And the great fleet would turn and come gliding in toward another port, in another country, full of people who had never in all their lives imagined that such a sight could exist. For the fleet did not sail out into empty, unknown waters. We should be honest about that. These were ancient sea roads, traveled for more than 1,000 years already by Arab and Indian and Malay and Persian sailors in their own fine ships. The ports the fleet came to were old and rich and busy, crowded with people and goods from 100 lands. Zheng was no lonely discoverer, finding blank places on an empty map. But even so, even in those old and worldly harbours, nothing remotely like this had ever before come up over the horizon. Hundreds of ships at once, sails like great moving walls upon the sea, and the towering painted treasure ships riding high above every other vessel in the water, vast beyond anything those ports had ever seen or dreamed. Picture those harbours gently, one melting softly into the next, the way that places do in a dream as you drift down towards sleep. There were the spice harbours of the warm southern islands, where the wharves were piled high with pepper and clove and nutmeg and cinnamon, and the very air itself was thick and sweet and heavy with the smell of them. There was a great trading city that stood upon a narrow strait, a city the Chinese fleet helped to protect and to raise up into wealth, where the goods of half the world changed hands in its crowded markets. There was the long and brilliant coast of India, with its ancient ports loud and bright and hot, the stalls hung with cottons and silks, and the warm yellow glint of worked gold. And everywhere, in every harbour, the same astonishment as the impossible ships came gliding in, and the little boats rowed out from shore to meet them, and the splendid strangers from across the world stepped down at last onto the wharves. And they came in peace. That is the thing to hold on to, if you hold on to anything at all tonight. They came to trade, and to honour, and to be honoured, not to conquer, not to seize, not to build empires upon other people's shores. They carried with them the very finest things that China could make, porcelain so fine and so thin that you could hold it up and see the light come glowing through it, silk in deep and shining colours that those ports had never seen the likes of, gold and lacquer work and crafts of every kind made by the most skilled hands in the world. And they traded all of it, gladly, for the treasures of the south and the west. Spices by the shipload, precious gems, ivory, fragrant woods and rare medicines, and strange and wonderful animals to carry home for the wonder of the emperor's court. And the fleet carried something else too on its long, slow journeys home. It carried people, ambassadors, envoys sent by all those distant kings and sultans invited to sail back across the world to China to stand before the emperor in his own great court and to see for themselves, with their own astonished eyes, the heart of the empire that had been able to send such a fleet across the whole of the ocean to their shores. Let yourself wander those warm harbors a little in the soft dark before we sail on. The smell of spice and salt and smoke. The bright hung cloth stirring in the sea wind. The crowds and the calling voices in a dozen tongues, and the little boats and the towering ships. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing at all that you need to remember. Just the bright ports drifting slowly past, and the patient ships, and the warm wind carrying you on. And on the later voyages, the fleet sailed farther still, out past the southern tip of India and across the wide open reach of the Indian Ocean, all the way to the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and the great rich trading port that stood there like a gate, and on, along the dry and ancient coast of Arabia, sailing near the holy cities of Zheng's own faith, the faith he had carried with him all the way from a mountain valley in China, and on again, farther than any of it, all the way to the distant coast of Africa, to the old stone trading towns strung along that eastern shore, where, to this very day, fragments of Chinese porcelain still lie buried in the sand, dropped there 600 years ago. That was the very edge of the world that the Chinese court knew anything about. About as far from the green misted mountains of Yunnan as a living person of that age could possibly travel and still, somehow, find his way home. And there is one thing that the fleet brought back from those far African coasts that I have always loved more than almost anything else in this whole long story, because it is gentle, and it is a little funny, and it is entirely, wonderfully true. They brought home a giraffe. Imagine it for a moment. A creature impossibly tall, with its long and impossibly slow neck, and its strange, soft, dark eyes, and its patient, gangling, careful walk. Caught somewhere on the warm plains of Africa, and led down to the sea, and lifted somehow into the hold of a treasure ship, and carried across thousands and thousands of miles of open ocean, all the way from the grasslands of Africa to the imperial court of China. And when it was at last led, blinking and bewildered, down the gangway and into that ancient court, the scholars and the officials gathered there looked up at it in pure astonishment, and they decided in their wonder that it could only be one thing: a creature out of their own oldest and most sacred legends. A gentle, magical beast, a being of good omen, said to appear in the world only during the reign of a truly good and truly wise and truly virtuous ruler. A sign sent down from heaven itself to say that all was well and that the one upon the throne was blessed. They had a name in their old stories for such a beast, and they greeted the tall, mild, gentle, thoroughly confused animal from the far plains of Africa as exactly, precisely that. A living sign of heaven's own favor walked carefully down a wooden gangway on its long and delicate legs. The emperor was overjoyed. The whole court rejoiced. Poems were written. It was taken as proof that the heavens themselves smiled upon all that they were doing. A giraffe, mistaken with the most touching sincerity for a heaven-sent miracle. Let that drift slowly through you in the dark with the beginning of a smile. It is, I think, one of the kindest and gentlest small moments in all of human history. And there was a real kindness, too, in the man himself, out there at the head of all that staggering power. In one island port, upon his travels, Zheng, who had been raised from birth in the Muslim faith, left behind him a single carved stone. And upon that one stone, written out carefully in 3 different languages, he set down his thanks and his offerings to 3 entirely different gods, to the Buddha and to Allah, and to a god of the local people of that island. 3 faiths, 3 peoples, honored together side by side in peace upon one quiet stone by a man standing at the very edge of the known world. He had room enough inside him, it seems, for all of it. There is something in that small stone worth carrying with you on a quiet night into sleep. You do not need to follow any of this, of course. Let all of it go as gently as it came. The night is wide and deep, and there is all the time in the world. For a long while, it must truly have seemed that it would simply go on forever. The fleets sailing out, year upon year, and returning low in the water with the treasures of the world. The ports of half the earth learning the name of Ming China, and the name of the tall, calm admiral who came to them in peace. The great treasure ships riding the monsoon south and riding it home again, season after season after season. But it did not go on forever. Nothing does. And the way that it ended is quiet and a little sad, in just exactly the way that the truest endings so often are. The old emperor, the one who had first dreamed the whole enormous thing into being, grew old, as all men do, and at last he died. And those who came after him, who sat in their turn upon that high throne, looked out upon the great voyages with very different eyes. They saw, above all, the staggering cost of it, the vast fortunes poured into those enormous ships, and into the feeding and the paying of all those tens of thousands of men who sailed away for years at a time to trade for giraffes and to carry home ambassadors and to show the world the grandeur of China. The court was full of careful, sober officials who thought, with some reason, that all that treasure would be far better spent at home. On the land, on the great rivers, on the long and troubled northern border where older enemies were stirring. And so, slowly, quietly, the will to send out the great fleets began to drain away, like water sinking into sand. There was one last voyage, the 7th, sent out years after all the others, when the admiral was already an old man. The greatest fleet in the world, sailing the long familiar roads south and west, one final time. And somewhere upon that voyage, or upon the long, long journey home from it, far out upon the very sea that he had given his whole life to crossing, the admiral died, the boy from the mountains, the servant who had risen. the man who had built the greatest fleet that had ever sailed. And by the oldest tradition of the sea, they gave him to the ocean itself, and the fleet sailed on without him, home toward China, carrying the news. And that was very nearly the end of all of it. The great voyages stopped. The orders came down from the court that they were not to sail again. And the magnificent treasure ships, those floating wooden castles, with no more oceans left to cross and no more ports left to astonish, were left where they lay, at their moorings in the quiet harbours. And there, slowly, over the long years, with no one left to sail them and no reason left to mend them, they began to rot. The great hulls softened, the bright paint faded and peeled. The towering masts came down one by one, and the greatest fleet that had ever existed in all the history of the world simply sat in its own harbours, in the rain and the sun, and quietly, year by year, fell to pieces and was gone. And it is even said, though no one can be entirely sure of it, that the very records of the voyages themselves, the charts and the logs and the careful accounts of all those far harbours and distant coasts were deliberately hidden away or even burned by officials of the court who wished the whole grand adventure to be forgotten, so that no future emperor might ever read of it and be tempted to begin the whole costly thing again. And China turned away from the sea. It turned inward, slowly, toward its own vast and ancient lands. And the great age of the treasure fleets, the age that might one day have carried Chinese ships in peace around the entire globe, simply closed and was over. And all of this happened decades, whole decades, before the first small ships of distant Europe began timidly and far away to feel their own way out down the coast of that same Africa, onto those same wide oceans, at the start of all that was to come. There is no need to feel that loss too sharply tonight. Let it be only a gentle sadness, the soft kind, the kind that loosens you and settles you, rather than the sharp kind that wakes you. The kind of quiet sadness that you can let yourself sink down into and fall asleep inside of, like sinking into a deep and well-worn chair. Because the wonder of it did not entirely vanish from the world. It never quite does. In all the ports that the great fleets had visited, the people remembered. All down the long coasts of the southern seas, in the trading towns of the islands and the straits and the far shores, the memory of the tall, calm admiral lingered and grew and softened over the centuries into something very close to legend. And to this very day, in those distant places, there are still shrines and temples that bear his name, built and tended, generation after generation, in memory of the gentle giant of a visitor who came to them from across the whole world, in his impossible ships, bearing gifts, asking nothing but friendship, and then was gone. They never forgot him. They have not forgotten him yet. And the things that he carried home, and the coasts that his navigators charted, and the simple, astonishing, undeniable fact of what was actually done, all of it has reached us. All of it has come down the long 600 years into this quiet room and this quiet night. The boy who was taken from the mountains and who went on to cross the entire known world, and who met that world not with a drawn sword, but with porcelain and silk and a deep and patient courtesy. Who sailed to the ends of the earth and brought home a giraffe and called it a blessing from heaven. We remember him still. You will remember him a little, even after you have forgotten every name and every date, the way you remember the feeling of a good dream. So we need not mourn it all too much. A thing so vast and so splendid and so strangely, wonderfully gentle that we are still telling the story of it, softly on a quiet night, 6 whole centuries later, half a world away. That, in the end, is not so sad a thing at all. That is its own kind of quiet immortality. But tonight, we do not need to follow it all the way down to the rotting ships and the burned records and the long closing of the age. Tonight, we can leave him where he was happiest, out on the open water, in the great years, with the whole fleet spread around him and the warm wind in the sails and all the world still ahead. So let us go back there one last time now as you drift away to the high deck of a treasure ship far, far out upon a calm and moonlit sea. The huge dark sails above filled softly with the night wind, stark against a sky thick and brilliant with stars. And all around, to the very edge of sight, the other ships of the great fleet spread wide across the gently rolling water, their lanterns small and warm and golden in the dark, rising and falling, slowly on the long ocean swell. And the man from the mountains stands quietly at the rail, as he must have stood on 1,000 nights just like this one, the warm wind moving in the rigging high above him, the soft and endless sound of the sea against the hull below, the whole vast sleeping fleet riding the slow swell beneath the turning stars, carried gently southward on the patient wind toward another dawn and another port and another quiet harbor somewhere at the far edge of the world. There is nowhere any of it needs to be tonight, and there is nowhere that you need to be either. So let the lanterns of the fleet grow dim. Let them blur and soften and fade, one by one, into the warm and gathering dark. Let the great sails fade away above you into the night. Let the slow sound of the water grow quieter and slower and farther away, until you can no longer quite tell the gentle rocking of the ship upon the swell from the slow and easy rise and fall of your own breathing and the deep, warm dark all around you. The sea is calm. The fleet is sleeping. The wind is warm and steady and kind. The night is deep and wide and safe, and you can let yourself go now, slowly, gently, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to be and nothing left to hold on to, all the way down, past the soft lantern light, past the dark and silent sails, past the very edge of the warm dark, all the way down, into a long and a deep and a peaceful sleep, Rest now. Good night. So, 700 years ago, far to the south of the Great Desert, in the west of Africa, there was a kingdom. It was called Mali, and it was vast, larger than most people today would ever imagine. It stretched across wide grasslands and slow brown rivers, across trading towns and quiet villages, across more land than nearly all of Europe held at the time. It was a green and golden country in its way. The great river Niger curved through the heart of it, bending like a bow, and along its banks the soil was rich, and the fishing was good, and the cities grew. And beneath the ground, and in the beds of the rivers, there was gold. A very great deal of gold. More gold, perhaps, than anywhere else in the world that anyone then knew of. The word for its ruler was Mansa. It meant something close to king or emperor, the one who holds the land. And in the year 1324, the Mansa was a man named Musa. He had come to the throne quietly some years before. The old stories tell that the king before him had grown curious about the great ocean to the west and had sailed out across it with a fleet of ships to find its far edge and had simply never returned. And so the crown came to rest gently upon Musa. He did not have to fight for it. It came to him the way evening comes to a quiet field, slowly and without struggle, and he wore it well. Under his rule, the kingdom was calm. The roads were safe. Caravans crossed the land without fear. The cities along its edges swelled with merchants and scholars and travelers, and the gold flowed outward into the wider world, carried on the slow backs of camels and the eager words of traders, until the name of Mali was spoken in faraway places by people who would never see it. But you do not need to follow all of that. Let it wash past you like water. The names will keep. Tonight, they only need to be soft sounds in a quiet room. Now, Mansa Musa was a man of deep and gentle faith, and in his faith there was one great journey that every believer hoped, if they were able, to make at least once in a lifetime. A pilgrimage, a journey to the holy city of Mecca, far to the east, across the desert and beyond. It was called the Hajj. For an ordinary person, such a journey could be the work of many years, a thing saved for and dreamed of and undertaken with great care. For a king as wealthy as Musa, it would become something the world had simply never seen before, and has, perhaps, never quite seen since. And so, in that year, 700 years ago, he began to prepare. The preparations took a long time. There was so much to gather, so many people to ready, so many animals and provisions and arrangements. But at last, one quiet morning, when everything was ready, the great company set out toward the rising sun. Picture it now, if you like, but gently. There is no need to hold the picture tightly. Just let it rise up on its own, the way images do as you drift toward sleep, and let it drift away again just as easily. A long line of people, stretching back across the land further than the eye could follow. So long that, the stories say, when the front of the caravan reached a resting place, the end of it had not yet left the last one. Some of the old accounts say 60,000 people travelled with him. 60,000. It is a number too large to truly feel. Officials of the court in fine robes, soldiers walking in long ordered ranks, servants and teachers and judges, and the keepers of the royal household. The king's own family, wives and children and friends. Whole communities moving together slowly, like a single great river of people flowing eastward across the land. And with all those people, the animals, thousands upon thousands of camels swaying patiently under their loads. Horses brushed until they gleamed, and the camels carried, among all the food and tents and provisions, the gold, heavy bags of it, bars of it, fine gold dust, sealed carefully into pouches and bound tight. The stories tell of hundreds of men walking near the front of the procession, and each one of them carried a long staff made of solid gold, heavy in the hand, bright in the sun. Imagine the light of the early morning catching on all of it at once. Hundreds of golden staffs, and the gold thread in the robes, and the trappings of the horses. A slow, shimmering river of light, moving across the pale and endless sand. There is something almost peaceful in it when you picture it slowly. A whole kingdom, gently on the move, unhurried, in no rush at all to be anywhere, because the caravan did not rush. It could not. A company that large moves only as fast as its slowest walker, and the desert has never been a place that rewards haste. The desert asks for patience. And Musa, it seems, had a great deal of patience. So they moved the way the desert itself moves, slowly, by its own quiet clock. In the heat of the day, when the sun climbed high and the air above the sand began to shimmer and bend, the caravan would stop. The great tents were unrolled and raised, billowing softly as they filled. The animals were watered and led into what little shade there was and allowed to fold their legs and rest. The people ate and spoke in low voices and lay down through the worst of the heat. And the whole vast company grew still beneath the high white sun and waited for the cool of evening. And then, when the sun at last began to sink, and the sky softened into shades of rose and amber, and the deep violet that comes just before the first stars, they would rise again. The tents came down, the camels were loaded, and the long line began once more to move. A river of lanterns now, swaying gently in the gathering dark. Small bells on the necks of the camels, ringing softly. A quiet music spread across the whole length of the caravan. And beneath it all, the low, endless sound of thousands of feet, moving as one across the cooling sand. Night after night, this is how they travelled. The stars wheeling slowly overhead, brighter than you have ever seen them, thick as spilled salt across the black. The desert breathing out the last of the day's heat into the cool dark. And the caravan moving through it all, patient, golden, calm, a small, warm world of lantern light, drifting eastward beneath the enormous sky. You may be feeling heavier now, warmer. That is good. That is exactly right. You do not need to stay awake to the end of the story. The caravan will carry on whether you are there to see it or not. You can let it go on without you, into the dark, and simply rest here, where it is warm and quiet and safe. The journey was long, very long. It crossed lands of soft sand, and then lands of hard stone, and then, slowly, green river valleys and ancient walled cities that had stood for 1,000 years. Week after week, month after month, and everywhere that Mansa Musa passed, he gave. This is the part of the story that the world remembered most. Long after everything else had faded, this is what people still told one another in distant countries for generations afterward. For Musa was generous, profoundly, almost unimaginably generous. It seems to have been simply his nature. In every town the great caravan entered, he gave gold away to the poor who gathered along the roads to watch him pass, to the holy men and the scholars and the teachers, to the leaders of the cities who came out to welcome him. He gave and gave and gave with an open hand and an easy heart, as though the gold were water and he stood beside an endless spring. He built places of worship as he traveled, leaving them behind him like footprints. It is said that wherever he stopped on a Friday, he ordered a new mosque to be raised so that his company might pray. He paid, freely and warmly, for everything his enormous host required, never haggling, never counting too closely. And he gave gifts that left the people who received them speechless for the rest of their lives. Let the names of the cities drift past you now. You do not need to keep them. Walata, Tuat, Cairo, just soft sounds carried on the night air. Let them go. When at last, after many months, the caravan reached the great city of Cairo in Egypt, the people there had truly never seen anything like it. Cairo was one of the grandest cities in all the world in those days. Its people were not easily impressed. They had seen kings and treasures and wonders of every kind. And yet, even they stood astonished at the sight of this king from a distant land, arriving from out of the desert with a fortune that seemed to have no end at all. Musa stayed in Cairo for some time, some 3 months, the accounts say, and in those weeks, he and his enormous company gave away so much gold, so freely to so many people, that something quite remarkable happened. Something that tells you, more than any number ever could, just how vast his wealth truly was. The price of gold in the city began to fall. There was simply so much of it, all at once, suddenly in so many hands, that gold itself became a little less rare, and so a little less precious. The markets of Cairo felt the gentle weight of one man's generosity for years and years afterward. Some say it took a full 12 years for the price of gold there to rise back to what it had been before he came. It is one of the very few times in all of human history that a single traveler, simply by passing through a place and being kind and giving freely, changed the fortunes of an entire region. not with an army, not with conquest, only with an open hand. And still, he went on. From Cairo, the caravan turned at last toward the holy city itself, and there Mansa Musa completed the pilgrimage, the journey of faith he had set out so many months before to make. He prayed in the places he had carried in his heart all his life. He walked where he had always dreamed of walking, and whatever he felt there, in the quiet of that, was his own, and the stories do not pry into it. They only tell us that he did what he had come to do, and that, surely, he was at peace. While he was in those eastern lands, he met learned men of every kind, scholars and architects and poets and teachers of law and of the stars. And some of them he gently persuaded to return home with him, all that long way back across the desert, to bring their learning to his own cities. And so the great journey carried wisdom in both directions, gold flowing out into the world and knowledge flowing quietly back. One of those he is said to have brought home was an architect, a man who would design new buildings in Musa's cities in a new style, with a tall and graceful tower of mud brick and wood. And in the city of Timbuktu, on the southern edge of the desert, those buildings rose. Timbuktu, which would become, in the years that followed, one of the great gathering places of learning in all the world. A city of libraries and scholars, of books gathered by the thousand, where people came from far away simply to read and to study and to think. All of it growing, in part, from the seeds carried home on the slow road from the east. But all of that came later. Tonight, let us not rush ahead to it. Let us stay on the road a while longer, where it is quiet. When at last he turned for home, the long road unspooled again behind him. The same desert, the same slow, swaying pace, the same lanterns in the dark, the same soft bells, the same enormous sky thick with stars. Month after patient month, the great caravan made its way back, westward now, toward the rivers and the grasslands, and the golden cities of Mali. And the world had learned his name. It would not forget it. Far away, in lands he had never seen and never would, map makers began to draw him into their maps. Years later, in Europe, across the sea, a mapmaker sat down to draw the whole of the known world as best he understood it. And down in the corner, in the place where Africa lay, he drew a single figure. A king, seated upon a throne, wearing a golden crown, holding up a single golden coin to the light, gazing at it calmly. And beside the figure, he wrote that this was the lord of that land, the richest and noblest king in all the region, on account of the great abundance of gold in his country. That mapmaker had never met him, had never come within thousands of miles of him. And yet, for generations, that was how the distant peoples of the world pictured the wealth of Mali. A calm king in a golden land at the far edge of the world, holding up a single coin of gold. It is a quiet kind of immortality, to be remembered 700 years on, not for cruelty or for conquest, but for an open hand and a long, patient journey, and more gold than the world could quite believe. But you do not need to remember it either. Not tonight. Tonight, you can simply let it be, the way you let a warm bath grow cool around you without minding, half asleep. Mansa Musa lived on for some years after he came home. He ruled his quiet, golden kingdom. He saw the new towers rise in his cities. And then, in time, as all kings do, and all people do, he came to the end of his road, and he laid the crown down, and he rested. And the kingdom went on without him, as kingdoms do, for many years more. But tonight, we do not need to follow him to the end. Tonight, we can leave him where he was happiest, on the road. Moving slowly through the cool of the evening, beneath a sky thick with stars, with nowhere he needed to be before morning. So let us leave him there. The lanterns are low now. The long line of camels walks on, slowly, gently, swaying through the dark. The little bells ring softly, and then more softly still. The sand is cool beneath them. The air is kind, and there is nowhere at all, that any of them need to be tonight. And there is nowhere you need to be either. So let the caravan drift on into the dark and out of sight. Let the lantern light grow small and smaller, a scattering of warm stars moving away across the sand. Let the sound of the little bells grow faint and fainter until you can no longer quite tell it from the quiet of your own room and your own slow breathing and the soft dark all around you. The desert is still. The great sky turns slowly overhead. The night is deep and warm and safe, and you can let yourself go now, slowly, gently, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to be. All the way down, past the lantern light, past the soft bells, past the edge of the warm dark, all the way down into a long and deep and peaceful sleep. Rest now. Good night.